Okay, so I'm going to show you results now, additional results from this last millennium reanalysis. And the main thing I want to share with you is a comparison between two observation models, two ways of modeling the proxies. The first one was the very first thing we did. It's the simplest thing we could think of, which was to treat every proxy as a linear recorder of annual mean temperature. Then the second thing we did was to follow the advice of the dendrochronologists, people who work on tree ring records, that they're mainly recording seasonal temperature, in particular summertime temperature, especially at high latitudes, but they're also sensitive to precipitation, soil moisture in particular, but we do have long enough precipitation data sets now to do that bivariate calibration. And we do an objective determination of the optimal seasonality that the trees respond to, and it's different and independent for temperature and precipitation. So this is kind of the best we can do with a bivariate fit for the tree ring width, based upon the two things that we think in the climate the trees are responding to that we have long records of. Ideally, we'd really like to use things like solar radiation and whatnot, but we just don't have records to calibrate on over long periods of time. So I'm going to show you the impact of the measurements in the reanalysis for these two forward models. Turning first to the annual mean forward models. So what you see here is a measure, a visual measure, of the impact of each one of the proxies scaled by how much influence it has. And it's color-coded by this legend over here. So, for example, this point right here is a coral record. It's an oxygen isotope record in the corals. And the size of the symbol tells us how much influence it had on the analysis. So where the symbols are large, it's relatively large influence. It explains more degrees of freedom. And where the symbols are relatively smaller, they explain fewer degrees of freedom. Okay, so the other thing I want you to appreciate is that, again, we have a lot of tree ring records. So from trees, we mainly have two things. We have the ring width, and we also have the density. The density is a measure of essentially the size of the cells in the cellulose and the thickness of the cell walls. And this turns out to respond very well to temperature, especially late in the year. The trees have an adaptation where they start preparing for winter. And if it's colder, they will put on thicker cell walls and the density will be higher. So this is known to be a very good measure of temperature, better than the ring width. And you can see that. Some of these symbols here represent density in Scandinavia. Okay, but for the most part, you see these larger symbols in the tropics with the corals. And now this is a map for the seasonal. So I'll do the little back and forth routine here. Annual, seasonal, annual, seasonal. Right.
It is not strange that there is nothing over Amazon?
Nothing over the Amazon? Yeah, so there are not many, if any, tree ring records there. So what dendrochronologists look for when they go for tree records is they want long-lived trees that are stressed by climate. So they'll often go to alpine regions where they're on the margin of survivability, right? Because any climate signal there gets magnified by the response of the tree. Places where trees grow happily and are not very stressed, or they don't live very long and they don't record the climate signal very long, have less information about the climate. So the temperature fluctuations here are relatively small. Yeah, so I think there are a few records. These are corals here. There are a few tree records from Africa. There are a few tree records from Chile, maybe Patagonia, but you have to get to the high latitude, southern latitudes. You can see there are some tree ring records in New Zealand and Tasmania as well. A lot of tree records around the Himalaya, Western North America. There are also a lot of tree ring records in Central and Eastern North America. They just have not been included in this data set that we're using here. We have another set which involves over 2,000 more tree ring chronologies that we're working with. It just hasn't been standardized by this body that I talked about this morning. Okay, so back to the main point here. What do we see? What do we see is that the coral symbols are not changing very much. But the trees, the greens and the blues are getting bigger, especially, look at the tree ring density. The impact of those records has increased dramatically. So we can summarize this by summing the impact. Again, because this is a trace, we simply can add the contributions from each one of these, and if we classify them, we can look at how much influence each one of these types of measurements had. So in terms of the total impact using the annual mean temperature, the tree ring width has the biggest impact. And that's largely because those are the most records. So they're noisy, they have a small bit of information, but when you add them all together, there's a lot. When you normalize them on a per observation basis, so we divide by the number of measurements, the trees on a per tree basis, a per chronology basis, actually have the lowest influence. So this goes back to what I said this morning. Noisy measurements are fine, especially if you have a lot of them, right? So there's not a lot of information in these trees, but you add them all up, and it turns out that's where the most information is in aggregate for any one of these types. Next up is the oxygen isotopes in the corals. And because there are not very many of those, the influence on a per proxy basis for the corals is quite high. Same thing for the ratio of strontium to calcium, which is another recorder of ocean temperature. And then after that, we have, this is density. MXD is the wood density measure. So there are fewer of those records, and they have a lot of impact on a per observation basis. And I think you know where this is heading. If we do this now for the seasonal treatment, the seasonal forward operator, we get this huge increase in the amount of information we're getting from the tree ring width and from the density, and on a per measurement basis, there's no doubt about it. Those are the most valuable records that we have. But it's only, and even things like lake varves, so these are cores of laminated lakes, it's only because we've treated these observations a little more faithfully to what they're recording that we can get this information. So the moral of the story here is that if you're working on a problem where you have an uncertain forward operator, it's okay. If you have a pathway for improvement, if this is a constantly evolving field of endeavor, you can model these things better, you will get more information out of the existing measurements that you have. You have to start somewhere. What's great about it is that there is a framework for you to measure that quantitatively and rigorously. So you can say, this forward operator is better than this forward operator, and for whatever reason. Okay, that's just a comparison of those two. The sensitivity of the total impact, sorry for the small fonts, but these are really just kind of research grade graphics. It's a very steep function of ensemble size. So this is really getting at that covariance, the relationship between locations. If it's highly uncertain, we can't spread the information from the measurements, right? That's the key thing that data assimilation is doing. So we get this very, very rapid rise in the amount of information we can extract from the measurements. And it continues to go up monotonically, all the way up to the largest ensemble we can make of 1,000, but it's pretty much reaching the asymptotic limit around 200 or so. So this is another way to choose the ensemble size, is how much information you think you can wring out for the computational resource that you have. This is the sensitivity to the number of proxies. So this is done in a Monte Carlo fashion by randomly drawing small sets of proxies and doing this over and over and over again and averaging the results. So a number of proxies on the abscissa, on the ordinates, the impact again. And here we see it's not quite a linear function, it's pretty close to it. So what this says is we're having a strong response to adding new measurements to this reanalysis. We're extracting more information, and we're nowhere near seeing this roll off. This is an under-observed system. If we could make more observations, we continue to learn a lot more about it. We continue to extract a lot more impact from the measurements we already have. I think people who work on paleoclimate proxy observations are going to be happy to see that. Whoops. OK, I'm getting a message that PowerPoint has encountered a problem and needs to close. So I'm going to have to fire that up again. Sorry about that. All right. I'm not sure what happened, but it choked. Okay. I'm just going to randomly skip forward here. Whoops, a little too far. Not bad, though. OK, that's where we were. So there's lots of things you can play around with here. This, in the blue line, shows the impact of a single proxy. So we can go through and say, if we just have one, how much impact does it have? Versus what we see here is the impact of that same individual proxy when we use all of them. And so you can see that we get an overestimate of how important that proxy is if we consider it only by itself. When we consider them all together, they're basically getting information. They're basically contributing information through the prior from what they would have had individually. We can do the exact opposite and do a jackknife experiment where we leave one out, so everything but leaving one out. And I'm plotting this as a scatter plot versus what we get from the control, from the self-importance that I showed you before. And you can see that that's actually a pretty good relationship there. So if you just leave one out and look at its impact, it's pretty close to what you'd get from doing them all at once. OK. Yeah. All right, this is the last little bit here. So what aspects are most robust? Again, this leading proxy singular vector is a weighted linear combination. The other one tells us this is the first one of the measurements, second one of the patterns. And we can look at how they go together. So here's an example of the leading spatial pattern that goes with the weight on the proxies. So you can see here the size of the symbol shows how much weight that proxy got in the linear combination that goes with this pattern. So this goes to the question before. This is a different year, I think. So the leading spatial pattern is different in this case. That was for the annual mean PSM. This is for the seasonal PSM, same sort of deal. We do see more of that global signature for the seasonal PSM. OK, so the summary here is that data assimilation provides the ability to measure observation impact. This is useful for assessing importance and filtering. I think it's mainly been used by the operational centers to measure the impact of their measurements in their observation stream. But there's no reason why you can't do it as well, why you can't use it for your research. I've shown here that the impact of the measurements is very sensitive to the forward model. And in particular, that it seems like the corals are going to work well if we only treat them as annual mean recorders. And if we get seasonal information, then the wood density and ring width are the most important. We have nowhere near enough measurements for this problem. And the leading spatial pattern looks to be large scale, and it identifies the robust combination between the regional proxies and the global climate patterns.